In 1982, the South Atlantic became the backdrop for one of the most intense conflicts of the 20th century, the Falklands War. What started as a territorial dispute between Argentina and the United Kingdom quickly escalated into a full-scale military confrontation. Fought over a small group of islands thousands of miles from both countries, the war would claim lives, test military strategies, and reshape the political landscape for years to come. The Falkland Islands, seemingly isolated in the vast South Atlantic, have a history marked by shifting powers, territorial claims, and international intrigue. But how did these remote islands, uninhabited when first discovered by Europeans, become the subject of such heated disputes? Let's rewind to the 18th century. In 1764, a French nobleman set up a colony here, only to have the British claim the islands just a year later, but the drama didn't end there. In 1770, the Spanish forced the British to leave Port Egmont, claiming the islands for Spain. For decades, Spain ruled the Falklands from Port Soledad on East Falkland, until political turmoil forced them to abandon the islands in 1811. By 1816, Argentina, newly independent from Spain, claimed the Falklands as part of its territory, but the British weren't ready to let go. In 1833, they returned and reasserted control over the islands. On April 2, 1982, Argentina launched a shocking invasion of the Falkland Islands, an act that stunned both the British public and the island's residents. This marked the first time since World War II that British territory had been invaded. Around 3,000 Argentine special forces led the charge, capturing the capital, Port Stanley, with little resistance. The island's small British garrison, only about 70 Royal Marines and sailors, took shelter in the government house, ready to defend the islands. The first assault came quickly as 16 Argentine commandos, led by Lieutenant Commander Pedro Gichino, attempted to breach the building. They were met with fierce resistance, forcing them to retreat after a heavy firefight. Gichino was wounded and died later in hospital, becoming the first casualty of the conflict. Despite their bravery, the British forces were outnumbered and outgunned. In the face of overwhelming odds, the British governor, Rex Hunt, made the difficult decision to surrender. Shortly after, the Marines laid down their weapons and were taken prisoner. Governor Hunt, along with his family and British military personnel, were flown to Argentina, marking the start of Argentine occupation on the islands. At the time, Argentina's military dictatorship, led by President Leopoldo Galtieri, believed the British wouldn't respond militarily. They underestimated the resolve of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher's response would surprise Galtieri, setting the stage for a conflict that would become known as the Falklands War. Thatcher, like most of the world, was caught off guard by Argentina's bold act of aggression. After the war, she admitted, "I never expected the Argentines to invade the Falklands head-on. It was such a stupid thing to do." The British government didn't expect a full-scale invasion, and many officials believed the military couldn't realistically recapture the islands. In fact, one Ministry of Defence official warned Thatcher, saying there was no certainty the British forces could even retake the islands if they were occupied. But that didn't deter Thatcher. She remained resolute. The Falkland Islands were British, and she was committed to ensuring they would remain that way. She and her government were unwavering and prepared for any necessary action to reclaim the islands from the Argentine invaders. Despite the odds, Thatcher's government was ready for a full-scale conflict to restore British control over the Falklands. Her determination to protect British sovereignty in the face of aggression would define her leadership. While Britain was prepared for a full-scale conflict over the Falkland Islands, one man tried to stop it: US President Ronald Reagan. In the midst of rising tensions, Reagan made an attempt to prevent war between Argentina and Britain. Reagan and his administration had worked hard to build strong ties with Argentina's military junta. The US saw Argentina as an important ally in its fight against communism in Central and South America. For this reason, Reagan wanted to avoid weakening General Galtieri's regime. To try and avoid conflict, Reagan sent his Secretary of State Alexander Haig on a diplomatic mission. Haig was tasked with meeting both Margaret Thatcher in Britain and General Galtieri in Argentina to facilitate talks and de-escalate the situation. However, these efforts were largely in vain. Both sides were firm in their positions, with Britain adamant that the Falklands were British and Argentina equally determined to hold on to the islands. The talks failed to bring any real compromise. As the negotiations faltered, the prospects of peace grew dim. With both nations refusing to budge, war now seemed all but inevitable. The British military mobilized a massive task force to travel just over 8,000 miles from mainland Britain to the Falkland Islands. On April 4th, the nuclear-powered submarine Conqueror set sail from Faslane, Scotland, marking the start of a high-stakes operation. Just a day later, the aircraft carriers Invincible and Hermes departed from Portsmouth, England, joined by their escort vessels, all heading toward the South Atlantic. Meanwhile, the British requisitioned civilian vessels for the mission. The SS Canberra, returning from a world cruise, was pressed into service and left port on April 9th, carrying the 3-Commando Brigade. And later, the iconic Queen Elizabeth II followed, setting sail on May 12th with the 5th Infantry Brigade on board. In total, the task force grew into a formidable force of 127 ships, 43 Royal Navy vessels, 22 Royal Fleet auxiliary ships and 62 merchant ships, all on their way to reclaim the Falklands. The first of these ships would reach the island on the 2nd of May 1982. On April 12, 1982, Britain took a bold step in its effort to regain control of the Falkland Islands. A 200-mile maritime exclusion zone was established around the islands. This meant that any Argentine ship entering this zone would be engaged by British forces. Later, this zone was expanded to a total exclusion zone, preventing ships and aircraft from any nation from entering without authorization. It was a clear statement by the British. They were determined to establish naval dominance around the Falklands. But it was the sinking of the Argentine ship General Belgrano on May 2nd that would become one of the most controversial moments of the war. The British submarine HMS Conqueror torpedoed the ship, resulting in the deaths of 323 Argentine sailors. It was the single deadliest event of the entire conflict. The sinking sparked heated debate. Argentina argued that the Belgrano was outside the exclusion zone when it was attacked, and some even labelled it a deliberate act of aggression, claiming it undermined any hopes of peace talks. On the other hand, many in Britain argued that sinking the Belgrano was a necessary move to establish naval superiority and ensure the safety of British forces. The General Belgrano sinking remains a landmark in military history. It was the first and only time a nuclear submarine torpedoed and sank a warship, and the second time since World War II that a ship had been sunk by a submarine. The sinking of the Belgrano was a turning point in the Falklands War, forever remembered for its controversy and its strategic impact on the conflict. Just 2 days after the British submarine HMS Conqueror sank the Argentine ship General Belgrano, another devastating blow was dealt in the Falklands War. On May 4, 1982, the British ship HMS Sheffield was struck by an Exocet missile launched by an Argentine bomber plane. The missile hit deep into the ship's control room, causing catastrophic damage. The Argentine government saw this as a justified retaliation for the sinking of the Belgrano just days earlier. To them, it was an act of retribution for their fallen vessel and sailors. Sadly, the sinking of the Sheffield resulted in the loss of 20 British sailors' lives, making it one of the most tragic moments of the war. The loss of the Sheffield was a stark reminder of the fierce conflict raging in the South Atlantic, with both sides paying a heavy price. Minus the sinking of the HMS Sheffield, Britain was actually seeing a lot of success in the naval part of the Falklands conflict. The Argentine Navy decided to pull out and adopt defensive positions closer to Argentina's mainland. This significantly reduced their ability to pose a threat to the British task force, giving Britain an upper hand at sea. But things were still heating up in the skies. Despite the shift in naval positions, Argentine jets continued to raid the British Naval Task Force, trying to disrupt operations. But the British weren't just sitting back, they were ready for the challenge with their advanced anti-air systems and aircraft like the Harriers, Vulcans and Sea Kings. The battle for air supremacy raged on as both sides fought for control of the skies, with the British forces doing everything they could to push back the Argentine aircraft. On the night of May 14, 1982, British Special Forces, specifically 45 SAS soldiers, launched a high-stakes raid on an Argentine airfield on Pebble Island. Their mission? To cripple the Argentine airbase and set the stage for a British landing. The SAS attacked under the cover of darkness, destroying 11 Argentine aircraft, which was a major blow to their air capabilities. This was a key operation that helped shift the balance of power and prepared the way for British forces to move forward in the conflict. Britain had secured naval supremacy and dealt a serious blow to Argentina's air power. With the naval advantage in their hands, it was time for the British to move forward with an assault on the islands themselves. The target was San Carlos, located on East Falkland Island. On May 21, 1982, the British Amphibious Task Group made its landing at San Carlos. The goal was to establish a secure beachhead, and despite some challenges, they managed to achieve this by dawn the following day. Once on the ground, British forces quickly dug in, setting up defensive positions and establishing patrols to secure the area. However, the Argentine air forces launched a series of attacks on and near the British positions. The British ships in the area took heavy damage, with some even being destroyed in the air. Raids, but despite these setbacks, the British managed to hold the beachhead, which provided them with a solid base of operations to begin their ground assault to retake the island. So, while the landing at San Carlos was met with opposition in the air, the British managed to secure a critical foothold. From there, they were able to press forward with the mission to reclaim the Falklands. After the British successfully secured a beachhead at San Carlos, there was a pause in the action. This delay created political pressure on both the British government and military command, as people began to worry they were losing momentum in the war. To address this, orders were given for British forces to advance. The British forces were split into two main groups, one aimed at the island's capital, Port Stanley, and the other heading towards Goose Green and Darwin, where a smaller Argentine garrison had set up. The soldiers heading to Goose Green faced incredibly tough terrain, making their way across challenging conditions from the beachhead. This would be the first major ground-level combat of the conflict. Once British forces, specifically 2 para, reached the enemy, all hell broke loose at the Battle of Goose Green. Despite being outnumbered by about 2-1 and lacking significant fire support, the British forces pressed on. The battle raged for 14 hours, with both sides putting up fierce resistance. Ultimately, the superior quality of the British forces overcame the larger Argentine defense, and the Argentinians were forced to surrender. The battle was a clear British victory, but it came at a cost. 18 British soldiers were killed, and around 64 were wounded. The Argentinians suffered heavier losses, with 50 to 55 dead and over 130 wounded. The biggest blow to Argentina, however, was the capture of 961 of their soldiers. Not only was Goose Green a major military victory, but it also had massive political implications. The success gave Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's government a huge boost, solidifying support for the conflict at home and raising British morale significantly. After the hard-fought victory at Goose Green, British forces set their sights on the capital of the Falklands, Port Stanley. But getting there wouldn't be easy. The road to Stanley was just as treacherous as the one they'd faced at Goose Green, with brutal weather and tough terrain standing in their way. The British needed to break through well-fortified Argentine defences surrounding Stanley, and this meant a series of intense battles in key locations: Mount Harriet, Two Sisters, and Mount Longdon. These battles would be crucial in securing the capital. In the west, the British saw success at Mount Harriet and Two Sisters. At Mount Harriet, 42 Commando launched a well-coordinated assault with artillery support, overwhelming the Argentine defenders and capturing key high ground. At the same time, 45 Commando led the charge at Two Sisters, pushing back the Argentine forces in a similar fashion. The British took control, securing vital positions on the mountain. The British suffered minimal casualties in these battles, just 6 soldiers lost, 2 at Mount Harriet and 4 at Two Sisters. On the other hand, the Argentines lost 38 men, with 18 at Harriet and 20 at Two Sisters. Over 350 Argentine soldiers were captured in the process. But not all of the battles would be this quick. The Battle of Mount Longdon would prove to be a far more grueling test for the British. The terrain was unforgiving, with rocky outcrops giving Argentine soldiers strong defensive positions. The Argentine forces were stretched thin, but they had the advantage of fortifying their positions over time. Trenches and machine gun positions made the fight a brutal one, and despite initial successes of holding British 3 para, with the British struggling to gain ground, in the face of fierce resistance, one soldier's bravery stood out. Sergeant Ian Mackay, leading the charge, launched a solo assault on 2 key Argentine positions. He successfully took both out, but tragically, he was killed in the process. For his extraordinary courage, Sergeant Ian Mackay was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. After 12 hours of brutal combat, the British emerged victorious, but not without cost. 23 British soldiers lost their lives and 31 Argentines were killed in the fighting, with 50 more taken prisoner. With Mount Longdon now secured, the British had made significant progress. Though the battle had taken longer than expected, the next phase of the assault was set to begin, and Port Stanley was now in sight. Though the road ahead would still be tough, the British had gained the upper hand. The decisive victory at Mount Longdon had paved the way for the final push toward the heart of the Falklands conflict. After the success of the first wave of assaults, the British forces were determined to maintain their momentum. The British had their sights set on two critical objectives, Mount Tumbledown and Mount William. Both mountains offered the Argentines natural defences with rocky terrain and fortified positions. The Argentine forces were well prepared, armed with machine guns and fortified positions. As well, part of Mount William was nearly impossible to approach due to its rugged landscape. To counter this, the British devised a diversionary tactic, launching an attack to the south of Mount William, designed to draw Argentine attention away from the real target, Mount Tumbledown. The diversion was a stunning success. The Scots Guards managed to capture a third of Mount Tumbledown without the Argentines noticing, but, as is often the case in war, this victory was short-lived. The British forces soon found themselves pinned down by intense Argentine fire, halting their advance. For hours no progress was made, until the British received much-needed relief from a heavy artillery bombardment. This bombardment allowed the British to continue their assault, slowly clearing the mountain and eventually capturing it, but not without a cost. 10 British soldiers lost their lives, while 30 Argentines were killed in the fighting. While the battle for Mount Tumbledown raged on, Tupara launched a bold offensive on another key position, Wireless Ridge, intending to close the gap around Stanley. The assault on Wireless Ridge was nothing like the quiet, stealthy approach at Tumbledown. This was a full-scale attack, with massive artillery bombardments and even British light tanks brought in to overwhelm the Argentine defenders. The heavy firepower was too much for the Argentines. They were quickly overwhelmed, and the British successfully secured Wireless Ridge. An attempted Argentine counteroffensive followed, but the British were in strong positions at Wireless Ridge, backed by artillery and tank support. The counterattack was easily repelled. In the end, the assault on Wireless Ridge was another British success, but not without casualties. The British lost 3 paras, while 25 Argentine soldiers were killed. With these key positions now secured, the British forces had once again made significant progress toward surrounding Stanley. With Wireless Ridge now secured, the Argentine defence had crumbled. Argentine troops were in full retreat, rushing towards Port Stanley, closely pursued by British forces. The British artillery hammered them from behind, tightening the noose around the capital. As British forces closed in from all sides, the reality was clear. The Argentines were now surrounded, both on land and at sea. On June 14, 1982, Brigadier General Mario Mendez, despite objections from Buenos Aires, made the decision to surrender. The war for the Falklands was finally over. The conflict had come at a heavy cost. In total, 907 men lost their lives, 255 British soldiers and 649 Argentines. Even the Falkland Islanders weren't spared, with 3 civilians tragically killed in the crossfire. While the fighting had stopped, the scars of this brutal conflict would remain for years to come. The Falklands War was over, but its impact would never be forgotten. While the Falklands War ended in 1982, its political impact would echo for years to come in both Britain and Argentina. In Argentina, the war led to the fall of General Galtieri. After his defeat, he was ousted from office, tried for war crimes in 1986 and convicted for his role in the conflict. Although he was pardoned in 1989, Galtieri was arrested again in 2003, shortly before his death. On the other side of the world, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher saw a surge in popularity. The British military's swift and successful campaign transformed her image, securing a landslide victory in the 1983 general election. This victory cemented her legacy as the Iron Lady. The Falklands War also left its mark on the future of the islands. In a 2013 referendum, the people of the Falklands overwhelmingly voted to remain a British overseas territory, with 1,513 votes in favour and only 3 against. A 90% turnout showed their firm commitment to British sovereignty. Despite the vote, Argentina still claims sovereignty over the islands, but for now, the situation remains peaceful. We can only hope that the violence of the conflict never resurfaces. The Falklands War was a defining moment in Cold War history, shaping the political landscape in both nations and influencing the future of the Falkland Islands. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your suggestions in the comments section for what topic you would like to see next.